people who gave their lives to make certain that we have the freedoms that we have in this country. So we are pleased to begin this inauguration today. We are calling this a series. At the end of this meeting today, I should have said session instead of meeting, but at the end of this session today, you'll be asked to complete a survey. There are several different sequences that we can go from here, and we'd like your opinion as to where you would like to see us go on our next series. Okay, enough of that. My time is going to be very brief because the important piece is coming, but a little bit about how we've decided to put this on. So it was important that we had somebody who knew how to manage an issue like the Constitution. We're very, very fortunate to have a long-standing member here at the Republican Club who has great presentation skills, terrific research skills, and is also a very passionate person about our Constitution. And we got all of that wrapped up into one person who for years has presented high-level information to CEOs of companies, and today, and I can tell you, I've been through this whole presentation. Greg has worked very, very hard on this. I think you're going to enjoy it. I learned a lot just going through the rehearsal for this event today. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you my dear friend and your presenter today, Greg Butler.
I want to thank everybody for being here today and giving up your Saturday to come and share. You know, we can ask the question, why do we need to understand the Constitution? What is it about this piece of paper that is so important? And I assume by your presence here, some of the younger people, maybe not totally voluntary, but the fact is, our founding fathers knew that if we are not an educated populace, if we don't understand it, we don't stand a chance of surviving as a republic. That is throughout the Federalist Papers. But when I look at what are the objectives, we're going to look at what were the environments that actually created America. And we're going to do a whirlwind tour through about 250 years of history that sort of pointed all the arrows to this ignition point that became the Revolution. We're going to jump into the Federalist Papers. If you don't know about the Federalist Papers, I hope when you leave here, it is my goal that you see this as one of the single most important debates. It is by far the highest political debate, high-minded political debate that has ever occurred. It occurred over multiple years. And we're going to get to look inside the minds of the founders. Then we're going to look at what is the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, how it's structured. Why does it matter? What would the world be like if we didn't have it? And then what is the role of government? How is the government structured? The separation of powers, the branches of government. A little bit of fact about how it came to be. Because if you look at what the framers did in order to craft it, you see how they got to the government that we have today. And so let's go ahead and take it. Now, I didn't do all this research on my own. I'm drawing from a number of professors. So Wilfred McClay, who has written a number of books on the American experience, the American history, fabulous kind of tour of America. These are a number of the professors that went into this, and you're going to see little video snippets of some of the lectures they've done. This is about 60 hours of lecture, and we're just going to pick some choice pieces that we're going to get to support our journey on this. So a lot of very, very great men. But I'm gonna lay this out, especially to the young people. We live in a world right now where there are two extremes in the view of America. One is America, the shining city on the hill, the land of hope, the best hope of mankind, this idea of American exceptionalism, that we're here because of some divine right given to us by the Creator, and that government is here to serve man and only through it, and that we are the best solution. Maybe we're not perfect, but we are the best solution and the best hope for humanity. Some of you may be old enough to remember this gentleman, but this was his...
And that's about all I have to say tonight, except for one thing. The past few days, when I've been at that window upstairs, I've thought a bit of the shining city upon the hill. The phrase comes from John Winthrop, who wrote it to describe the America he imagined. What he imagined was important because he was an early pilgrim, an early freedom man. He journeyed here on what today we call a little wooden boat, and like the other pilgrims, he was looking for a home.
Okay, let's try this again. All right. So, in this, Reagan clearly refers to John Winthrop, who landed, and we're going to hit this a little bit later, and really talked about, he gave a prayer before they got off the boat. Somebody recorded it, and it's an elegant prayer about what they were doing, why they were doing it, why they were here in this new world. And Reagan expounded this theme better than anybody. But it really positioned when you talk about American exceptionalism, you're not talking about that we're better than everybody else. It was that we were founded and developed a government that is one of the best hopes for mankind. Now, why would we say that? If you go through all of antiquity, it's a pattern of one tyrant after another. They overthrow the tyrant, they put in somebody else, it ends in anarchy, then they put in the next tyrant. Montesquieu, who we're going to get into, was a French philosopher. And he even wrote, he wasn't sure that man could even ever be self-ruled. And that weighed on the minds of the founders. You may not have realized that, but they were even wondering whether man could self-rule. Because there's no evidence in history up to that point that man could even begin to self-rule. And you say, well, what about what about the city-states of Greece? And what about them? They all collapsed and they all ended in despotism. So we're going to get into that. But now the other one, we hear this every day. America's illegitimate. Oh, it's, the founders were all slaveholders. They were just a bunch of rich, they were a bunch of rich, privileged men, and they, this whole thing about the Constitution needs to be reworked. It needs to be elastic. We need to adjust it for our time. We're not an agrarian society with a bunch of frontier backwoodsmen out there. This thing needs to evolve. And government, this whole Constitution thing is really just slowing us down. And so people have evolved. We need to get on with it. And the real question, too, is this balance between individual rights and the needs of society. How does that play out? And that is right down this path. So today, we're going to look at this. We heard Reagan discuss it. So let's go here.
It's theory, the social compact theory of the Declaration of Independence, because the regulatory aims of progressivism, the redistributive aims of progressivism were on a collision course with the political theory of the Declaration and therefore of the Constitution. That basic fact, that basic realization of the progressives makes understandable an admonition that was made by Woodrow Wilson, one of the most important, not only progressive intellectuals, but progressive politicians. This was in an address that he gave kind of ostensibly honoring Thomas Jefferson on the occasion of the 4th of July. Wilson said the following: "If you want to understand the real Declaration of Independence, do not repeat the preface, do not repeat the preface. Well, what's in the preface to the Declaration of Independence? You might not have known that it had a preface. What Wilson means there is simply those early paragraphs of the Declaration, the parts that most people would identify as the heart of the Declaration. All men are created equal. Government comes only from their consent. The purpose of government is to secure life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's what Wilson.
Well, we're going to have an interesting day. So let's just get this running again, and I will skip some of the slides. What he's getting into is that Wilson began to basically say, ignore the preamble to the Constitution. Now, why in the world would anybody do that? Pick up your pocket guide for a second and follow with me. Turn to the beginning of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. Look down at the second paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter and abolish it and institute a new government, laying the foundation on such principles as organizing its power in such form as that they should be likely to affect their safety and happiness. The important part of that is this was a very, very bold statement. Where did power originate up to this notice to the world? By the way, you notice this doesn't say just for American citizens. This was a notice to people all around the world. All around the world. That all people. Now wait a minute, some of you might be saying, well, what about slaves? Well, what about women? What about... You're absolutely correct. That's part of why our Constitution's been amended 28 times. But in that time, it was a declaration that we, the people, and you notice on the lead slide how we, the people, is always emphasized in all these documents. That's not a graphic choice. That wasn't for artistic sake. That was a declaration that the people are sovereign, not some king, not some warlord, not some tyrant. Power comes from the people, and they give consent to the government for the powers that they will give. That is what that meant. So we're going to try the audio again.
If you take attention away from the structural guarantees of your rights, which are in the body of the Constitution, then you start neglecting the structure of the Constitution. And that's exactly what the progressives wanted to do. They wanted what Woodrow Wilson.
Okay, well, we're going to be done with videos. So I'm not sure what is happening with the system, but we will get there. All right, let's go down, and we'll just go to... Let's get into what this Federalist Papers are. What are they? What are the Federalist Papers? Well, they were about 85 essays that were written, and they were penned under a name called Publius. Well, who the heck is Publius? You know. Why were they written and what were they done? Yeah. Because that was this massive debate that occurred after the framers actually got the Constitution written. They still had to, and deliberately they said it must be ratified by each of the 13 states. And so they wanted it approved by the people, but where there's Federalists who say we need a stronger central government, there were anti-Federalists. And this was a months-long debate, even years, that went down. And the question in the debate of the ages, is mankind even capable of ruling himself? Because history would tell you no. That, I mean, the Romans had it, well, they wound up with Caesar. And a whole string of despots. They started out as a small republic, and their own success kind of hoisted them by their petards. They got to a point where they weren't anything like a democratic. So kings and tyrants, and this notion of, are we forever to be destined? This was part of the debate. Are we forever to be destined by accident and force? Meaning whoever has the strongest army is going to be our king. Or by some birthright or by some genetic thing, we're going to have that person as ruler. So if we go down there, let's look at how we got there. This revolution of self-rule. They didn't wake up one day and say, you know guys, I think we can go ahead and do this all by ourselves. I think we can just go and become our own country and let's kick the king out. What was occurring? Well, if we're going to go down that path, we have to start looking at the unsettlements that were going on in Europe. I mean, these were still Europeans. For the most part, they were Europeans. And they came with all their traditions, and they came everything from Europe except one thing. They didn't bring the aristocracy, and they didn't want the aristocracy. But things were kind of breaking down in Europe. And there was some ideas that, well, maybe we need to restrict the king. Maybe the king needs to be under control. There were some major things happening in the churches. So if you look down, one is the Magna Carta in the 1200s. This, you know, people will point to this like, oh, this is the birth of freedom. For maybe a couple people, but it was really the land barons of England saying to the king, enough, or you're going to have a civil war on your hand. You're going to have a revolt and a rebellion. It wasn't a document for all the people, but it did get into this idea that people have rights. Like, you can't throw us in prison and let us sit forever without charges. If we're in prison, we deserve to go have a speedy trial. This kind of thinking was there, and it really, this pushback on, well, you can just rule by divine fiat. That's how it's going to be. Divine fiat is going to take care of everything. So, you know, you saw this happening, and the king started to go. But it really was only to protect down there the very elite and the barons. If you were just an old common person like me, you had no rights. King could trample you at any minute, and the barons could trample you. Now you had some other things that were fracturing. Up until this point, right before the revolution, you had some major changes, and that was the world was Catholic. Europe was Catholic. The Catholic Church and government were intertwined. The monarchies were intertwined. Even King Henry was called the great defender of the Catholic Church, right? All that. But then you had Martin Luther emerge. And Martin Luther took issue with what the doctrine of the church. And then you had John Calvin. Two men, both reformers, but they were reformers for a different reason. Let's look at John Calvin. John Calvin said his objection was more to the way the church was organized and run. In other words, all this stuff that goes on, this should be lay involvement. There should be some councils and some government within church governance that involves the people that are in the church. And so I'm not going to try to say
Reformation.
So you still had this division too. The three big world powers at that time all had big navies. We think of air superiority, all you youngsters. You know, who has the best air force is usually going to win the war. That's been it for the last 100 years. That's pretty much how it's all going down. Back then it was, do you have a strong navy? And you're going to see how that played out. So it was primarily the Spanish, the English, and the French. And they were running around everywhere planting flags. So every little unoccupied land and some occupied, they were coming and claiming it as their territory. And you had very different approaches to this. But Spain and France, we still had in France King Louis and Philip II, who were sitting there, and they were 100% monarchs. When you think of a king, they were all powerful. There was absolutely nothing they couldn't do. But the English king had constraints, and since we're derived from England, we know that was brought over, that the king can't just do whatever he wants to do. And this is an important distinction because it will emerge here in its relevance. So, what was Spain's mode of operation? Spain was simple. It was state-run. They didn't vote on things. They went out and they had two missions. Find as much gold, as much silver, and as much precious gems as you can and bring them back to the sovereign in Spain. You see, back then they couldn't print money like we do, so they had to go get real money and bring it back to keep all this venture going. And the other part was leave missions behind. Put missions in for the Catholic Church. That was what they did. But the idea of full colonization, of setting up these communities, that was not the Spanish way to do it. So when you look around Texas, you know what? We have San Antonio, we have all this San Antonio and look at the countries in Central America, El Salvador. Okay, that was their influence, and they were big in that. The English had a very different approach, and it would almost be a complete laissez-faire sort of live and let live. They used independent organizations, like we would call them venture capitalists, and the king would give them a grant, which is land he didn't own, and say, "All right, yeah, go over there to that Virginia thing, and you go be a colony." And they really had to figure it out themselves. It wasn't like they sent, troops and British officers and all that, and they had some form of government. They had to figure it out themselves. And this is the beginning of sort of the American experience, is that these colonists had to figure it out. And that's what they did. And they really saw the colonists as kind of trading partners. But this is key. English had no grand vision. But all this conquest, keeping a big navy, some of the conflicts that were happening with the French, some of them that were happening with the Spanish, were big deals. They were costly. And so by the time that we get to the Revolution, prior to that, all of a sudden now King George starts to crack down on them. He starts to say, we need worldwide, we have got to come up with a strategy. And it's got to be good for England. It's got to be good for the mother country. And it'd be like having your teenagers and letting them go free for 3 years, and all of a sudden now you're going to hit them with a bunch of rules and tell them how they got to do things and put all that supervision. That's what was occurring in the colonies. It was not necessarily a good thing. There was something else going on. We have in our day, we have state-sponsored terrorism, right? Back then they had state-sponsored pirating. And one of the most successful pirates who became a vice admiral in the British Navy is a guy by the name of Sir William Drake. And he circumnavigated the globe. He said, I'm going to go all over. And I don't think the Spanish are defending it. So when they're bringing back these galleons full of gold and silver, I'm going to loot them. And he did it very, very well. And he returns to England with a boatload. I mean, when I say a boatload, I'm talking a real boatload full of gold. Like, in today's value, it'd be 160 plus million, probably more. And very successful. Queen Elizabeth recognizes him, and he winds up being a vice admiral, which will come in here in a little bit. And so this all goes down, and it brought the attention to Spain. His success and the success of some others got the attention of
Politically.
King Philip. So King Philip II says, I am not going to put up with this. I'm going to build the Invincible Armada. That's what he called it, the Invincible Armada. And I'm going to sail right up the English Channel. I'm going to take over and depose Queen Elizabeth I, And I'm going to put the Catholic Church back in there because King Henry wound up disaffecting the church too because of why? He wanted an heir for the House of Tudor. The Pope and he get into it, and the Pope for political reasons and he for political reasons go their own way. And now all of a sudden, there's the Anglican Church, and more fracturing is going on. Well, that didn't sit well. And so Philip wanted to come in and clean all that up. And now you had that colliding with the Protestant Reformation, and they were going to go make it right. So Philip gets this big, massive armada, and here he comes. And he's soundly defeated by the British. I mean, soundly. And that's a story in and of itself. Naval innovation, all this, I mean, the strategies they used, and some good luck and fortune. They scattered this fleet of Spanish galleons and decimated. And now England's kind of standing there as the undisputed world power. The, quote, superpower. You still had France out there, but France wasn't their big rival and enemy. And it really does change what happens in America. Because now, you see Spain never recovers. Spain's hold starts slipping. Their ventures out on the sea start diminishing. And it really sort of cements, some would say, what America's not going to be, but it also cemented what it is. It cemented the fact that, we were going to govern a certain way. Now, one of the myths that we will get into, and there's a couple of these myths, is that all the colonies were the same. We think of them, all the pilgrims, and they all got off. The answer to that is absolutely not. Because when you read the charter of John Smith and going into Virginia, it was mined for silver and gold, and it sounded like the Spanish charter. It didn't sound like the English charter, it sounded like the Spanish charter. On the other hand, part of what Reagan was referring to is when Winthrop arrives, before they disembark from the ship, he holds his prayer, and he says, the entire eyes of the world, the hope of mankind, is on our shoulder. These guys have landed on the dark side of the moon on a little wooden boat we would call a dinghy. They traveled, 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks by sea. They arrive. And he gives this speech about the grand vision. A very, very interesting charter of how he saw this as a new way, a new beginning, and something that would be a model for all mankind. And that's before he let them off the boats to begin the Boston colony. A little other side note, this little trivia here. With Virginia, what was the salvation of Virginia? There were two things. First of all, they were founded as a commune, and they almost all starved. They were all going to throw their crops and all their stuff into a pot and distribute it as needed. And in the writing of John Smith, he talks about how that really didn't provide a good work incentive, and there were people with large families and single men, and it all just didn't work. So the second year, he divided them up, and he divided them into, he gave every man a certain plot of land, and if you had excess, you got to sell it. And they began to prosper. But what was it that allowed Virginia to survive? Exactly. If you go take a tour of the Capitol, what's carved on all the top of the columns? There's little leaves up there, tobacco leaves. That's how strong it was. But that's what allowed them economically to have a sustainable economy. But what I'd like you to know is that the missions of all these different colonies was quite different. Georgia was started as a New Age utopia. One of the, as we're going to find out, one of the big slave holdout states. It was going to be this new way of living for mankind.
Colonization. It's unlike the Spanish.
So anyway, we're going to get to, here's the global war, and now get to this notion that all of a sudden, King George is just cracking down, and he's throwing taxes, he's throwing tariffs, he's quartering soldiers in people's homes. There was the equivalent of the O.J. Simpson trial, where 2 of the British Marines killed colonists, and it was a sham trial. Then you have King George going around invalidating the Continental Congress and basically removing the judges, and stuff couldn't get done. These people still had to live. They still had to, and you know, you're still 6 to 8 weeks away by anything coming by ship, and now he's bringing over his judges, the king's judges, paid by the king, and things were not going well. It was really descending, and you have this notion that, you know, the conditions for a rebellion are there, and that's what's getting started. So here's some myths we also have. Well, all the colonists, you know, we see the little movies and we see this, and we notice we get a cartoon version. That everybody hated the British and everybody was ready for the British to get out. Let's run them out of town, let's get them out of here, we're all in it, let's go. And the answer was no, they were not. About 1/3 of them wanted nothing to do with it. They saw themselves as British citizens. They didn't get involved. They even worked against the Patriots. There was 1/3 of people that had no opinion. They just were kind of like, I'm kind of out here, I'm not going to get involved. And at the beginning of this, about 1/3 of people were what we picture, you know, the Mel Gibson kind of patriot, and, you know, grab a gun and a musket and we're going and fighting. That was the way it started. And that, here is the biggest thing. When you go through all the Federalist Papers, all the research, you will not find any semblance or iota that the Founding Fathers had a plan for how they were going to take down England. Again, you're picking a fight with the most powerful nation on the planet. And number 2, that they had any idea of what kind of government they would put in place should they even begin to win. So if they won, they didn't know what the government would be. They had a Continental Congress, and they had signed something called the Articles of Confederation, which starts off, well, it's a league of friendship. Well, doesn't that put a terror into the heart of your enemies? You know, you're going against the nation, this league of friendship. And it was not working at all. So with that, this conflict begins to escalate. And these are some of the things. You've heard them. Taxation without representation. Suspension of the legislature. British soldiers, the fact they were even there without certain permissions. And this dereliction of duty comes out. They had cut off trade, they had done this, but basically King George was not doing the basic things to allow them to survive, and it was getting worse. But the match that finally set it off was when they started ordering troops. Imagine you've got a little farm and you're surviving, barely, and all of a sudden you've got, General Cade shows up and he's parking all his soldiers in your house and in your barns, and he's eating your livestock, and and nothing you can do about it. And you're now threatened. That was sort of the thing that sent it over the edge. The second big issue was they're going, wait a minute. We know British common law. And if you're saying we're British subjects, you're not even treating us with that same respect as a British subject. You're not even giving us the same things. I mean, we're getting thrown in jail without a charge. We're not getting speedy trials. You're abusing us in ways you would never be allowed to abuse a British citizen. And those combined to really get to a point where this started to become a hot war. And, we've all heard about the Boston Tea Party and all that kind of stuff. But it was the march into Lexington when the British went in. Here's an interesting fact I found. I didn't know this before studying. On July 4th, they were signing the Constitution, they were signing the Declaration of Independence. Did you know that on that very day, the British landed 30,000 troops unopposed on Staten Island? So they're all celebrating the fact that they've got this great document and they're going to be sending it to the king, and they got all the states to sign on, and off it's going to go. But the seeds for conflict were already planted, and we're now moving into this hot war. And so on that day, 30,000 troops land on Staten Island, and it was, and this was really revolutionary in thought, which we hit. The rights came from the divine creator. We have to deal with the slave and the issue of women and their rights. But this is the big claim. And John Adams made an interesting statement. Some of you may have heard it. Upon signing it, you say, well, surely these men had to know that when they wrote their name on the Declaration of Independence and it was read by King George, their names would be on a death list. They were going to hang or rot in prison at best. They were not going to go unscathed. So Ben Franklin said, well, we must all hang together, or most assuredly we will all hang separately. So they knew they had lit a fuse that they could not put out. And regarding the conditions, this was John Adams writing in Post, I found it. The revolution was effected before the war commenced. People saw the behavior of the king, the laws, the Constitution, derived from the God of nature, transmitted to our ancestors, and violated and renounced by the king and Parliament. This radical change in principles and sentiment of the people occurred. That was the real revolution. In other words, all the stuff he did and the escalation of it, and the fact that they knew as English citizens they had certain rights, and the king just trampled them. So this is when the hot war occurred. They're marching to basically go steal all the arms. You think that might have anything to do with the the Second Amendment? They're marching to the supply depot in Lexington, and this is where the first shot was fired, and it began to become a very hot war. But you probably have heard the pen is mightier than the sword. There was a very rich series of communications, and John Dickinson wrote in this, torn from the body which we are united by religion, liberty, and law, affections, relations, language, and commerce. See, they didn't think of themselves as a nation. They just thought they were 13 independent states. They had some things in common. But he said, this is where he's saying, if we don't hang together, we're going to get torn apart. Every one of us as an individual is vulnerable. United we stand, divided we fall. That's where that came. This idea of if we unite into a stronger form of government and we hang together through the revolution, we can win. John Payne wrote Common Sense, which at the time was a big seller, and really started to persuade people. So the percentage of people that were willing to fight this began to grow and grow and grow. But how bad did it get? George Washington is an absolutely indispensable figure, and the more you read about him, he was admired by all. He was highly, highly trusted. He wasn't necessarily the greatest of intellectual minds like a Madison or a Jefferson, but people trusted him. And he was able to hold the Constitutional Army together. It started with about 28,000 troops, but how bad did it get? He got down to about 3,000 troops. He had very, very bad morale. People were defecting, people were sick, people died. And then he had a couple very surprising victories. But in the midst of this, Thomas Paine wrote this passage which began to change people's minds again. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier, the sunshine patriot, will in crisis shrink away from service to their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of men and women. And so he's really getting into it. I mean, he knows times are bad, but we have to hang together and get through this. So George Washington goes in. Of course, we've all seen the great pictures of him in the boat and all that. We don't want to mess up a good story. That image may not be historically correct. But he did cross the Potomac. And he defeated the absolutely hated Hessian mercenaries. The not the patriots, but the colonists were insulted by the fact that King George would send over this German mercenary army and defeat them. And they wanted to defeat him. In Princeton, he was able to make a tactical move, and he cut off the British supply lines. And then in Saratoga, he actually surrounded and captured British soldiers. So 3 victories in a big campaign. What is that? Well, what it did is it got the attention of the French. And the French kind of said, well, maybe these Americans can pull this off. And they started relationships with America. Ben Franklin was the diplomat that was working a lot of this. But what he gained was access to the support of the French Navy, which ultimately allowed George Washington, in a pincer move, to trap Cornwallis and to be able to get a surrender. And so that was part of the key to winning the war. But it got very, very bad. Here's another myth. You know, you see Cornwallis signing the treaty and all this, and George Washington and the pictures and all that. And the British, you know, sailed back to England, said, you know, have a great life, hope, wish you well, and got up and left. That did not happen. They still had forts, they still had troops, they still controlled the ocean. And King George III was not a good loser. So he put trade embargoes on and tariffs on all kinds of American products. He made life miserable for the Americans after the war, after independence. And I mentioned earlier that the colonists were governed by this Articles of Confederation. Every state had its own currency. Can you imagine going from Oklahoma to Arkansas and you've got to change currency from Texas money to Oklahoma, and then, you know, and when you got there, because, you know, you're from Texas, you might have to pay more for gas and pay a surtax on it. It got real confusing, and the states were fighting amongst themselves. They had territory disputes. They all acted like their own little fiefdoms, and there was a real fear that the colonies were going to fail. And so here we enter in Alexander Hamilton, who began this effort to say, we need a stronger government. And behind the scenes, he was part of the driving force that got to the point they had the Constitutional Convention. But it didn't start as a Constitutional Convention. They all got together because they were going to amend the Articles of Confederation. The way they amended it was they abolished it. And they developed the Constitution, which we're going to get there. But this is his reflection after the war. The real wonder is that so many difficulties should have been surmounted with the unanimity almost as unprecedented as it must have been unexpected. It is impossible for any man of candor to reflect on the circumstances without partaking in astonishment. It is impossible for a man of pious reflection to not perceive the finger of the Almighty hand, which so frequently extended to our relief during the Revolution. In other words, he is tipping, acknowledging that if it was not for divine intervention, he didn't see how else it could have happened. It got that bad. And they were able to put it all together. And this is him reflecting afterwards. So we're going to get on to building the Constitution, but I got a little quick table exercise for you. How many of you like trivia? Yep. Woo-hoo! If you could help me hand these out, one to everybody, and I'm going to read the instructions, and we're going to take this real quickly in 5 minutes. Get your best answer on there. If you don't know, don't don't vote. And then we're going to tally them up because, quote, we're a democracy. You pick the most popular answer. So have one person at the table take them, and if 5 people answer A, that's your answer. So whatever the majority is. And then we'll go. So go ahead right now and take just a few minutes. Try to answer the question yourself.
Oh, I see what you're doing. Never mind.
That doesn't apply to us. That doesn't apply to us. This is the illegal. This is the illegal.
This extra seat right here.
Okay, let's wrap it up in about another minute. Okay, another minute, 60 seconds.
We said once before.
Okay. Can I have everybody's attention up here? We're going to be breaking a little bit, but let's go through these. What is the age requirement for president specified in the Constitution? 30 years. 30 years. The Constitution provides for how many members of the U.S. House? How many? 435. circle to be a Supreme Court justice? There are none. Any one of you technically could be a Supreme Court justice. What are the term limits for the president at the signing of the Constitution? None. That wasn't added till much later. How many times has the Constitution, you know, people argue this thing doesn't change, it's too hard to change. How many times has it been amended in the history of our nation? Very good. Good. Okay. What was the answer on the office terms for President, House, Senate, and Supreme Court? B is the appropriate answer. Yeah. What limit, this is an important question, so I really need what limit does the Constitution place on the federal government? Pick the best answer. C is the appropriate answer because it is a power of the negative, meaning if I don't tell you you can do it, you do not have the power. Okay, it's very clear in that. Ooh, here's a bonus question. Place a check mark next to all those who are considered part of the country's founding fathers. A was A? Yes. B? Yes. What about C, John Jay? Who's he? What? Oh yes, he was one. What about Publius? Publius? Who? You never heard of Publius? How about A, all the above? Oh, we're going to get into that. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution are known as what? Nobody put habeas corpus? Okay. You are absolutely correct. When you cast a vote for president, you are voting directly for the president. B, an elector who will cast a vote for the president of your choice. So we're going to get into these things, but let's move on, and then we're going to get to a little break here where you can get up and stretch your legs. Well, who the heck is this Publius? Well, the debate for ratification was raging. I mean raging. And there were people saying, on the anti-federalist side, they took on the name Cato and Brutus. Everybody knows who Brutus is. He took out the tyrant. So the anti-federalists were very concerned, more so about, everybody was concerned about creating a new tyrant. But Bruto and Cato, they didn't want a big, strong federal government. Alexander Hamilton had enlisted a couple individuals, some of them are named, some of them are not named, to contribute to the Federalist Papers, which put the case forth of why the Constitution was going to work and why it was built the way it was. And it's a very high-level debate. Well, Alexander Hamilton was the spark plug, but they adopted the name Publius. He's considered the creator in 500 BC of the Roman Republic, which, prospered a few years in there. But he actually overthrew a monarch and created the Roman Republic and was considered the father. And the three main contributors to this were Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, who was considered the head driving intellect, and then John Jay. Anybody know what John Jay's first governmental role was?
Chief Justice.
Chief's our first Chief Justice. Very good. He looks like a lawyer, doesn't he? He looks lawyerly. Okay, now, when they got into, I've got to give you one other piece of background on this, or you're going to go, what is he talking about? Well, they keep talking about the oracle. And they keep talking about this guy called Montesquieu. Well, who is Montesquieu? He's a peer of theirs a few years ahead. He died right before, about 10 years before the Revolution. But he spent his entire life writing works called The Spirit of the Law, is some of his best published work, looking at every single form of government. How many in the room believe in democracy? I mean, pure democracy. Huh? In a pure democracy, if we needed to go to the grocery store, we would all have to take a vote on every single item. And only in a very, very narrow set of circumstances can democracy even begin to succeed. Then you get into republics, and one of the Montesquieu's arguments is, well, republics can only, history says they've only, representative republics have only been able to survive when they're limited to a very narrow geography. I mean, you can look at Sparta, you can look at Athens, you can look at all these Greek city-states, and where are they now? What happened? If you're a military kind of, conquesty kind of country and want to be strong, what kind of government do you want? You want to go into battle with a democratic process? No. You want to go into battle with... No. A little trivia for you. One of the most democratic societies that has ever existed, pirates. Up until the point they went to attack a ship, everything was a vote and people had a say. Once they went to war to go loot the ship, captain was in absolute control. It's a cultural thing, but the captain just didn't get up and say, oh, we're going to go attack that ship. And they actually had a say, because they were all mercenaries anyway, so they all had a say. That notion of strength and weakness, what Montesquieu would argue for is, you look at this Articles of Confederation, and they knew it was ultimately doomed to fail. They were going to fight amongst themselves. They were vulnerable to any foreign power that wanted to take them over. If they didn't cut their own throats, the French were still there, the Spanish were still there, the English are still messing around with it. So that whole thing was, and the words even got used as we looked down, that it was too weak and imbecile. I mean, that was their own words. So when they got together for this convention, the question was asked, is any of this working? And the one thing they agreed on instantly was no. Can anybody tell me how one of your state governments is the model we ought to follow? The answer was no. Because Jefferson was even referring, he was the governor of Virginia, and he refers to, that he's got a group of 147 tyrants because the legislature was so far out of their lane. So they really didn't know what to do. But Hamilton, in one of the early Federalist Papers, put forth this, and you can sum it, this is fancy language. Well, don't look to see if this is the best form of government, but is it better than the one we have? In other words, any of you got a better idea than what we're doing? Anybody out there got anything else? And the answer was, well, not really. And so they began to work, and they came together and began this rich debate. So here's another thing. You want to put this in perspective. They have won their independence, right? That took approximately 5 years of fighting. Now they've got this constitutional convention that ended after another 6 years. So they've gone through 5 years of trauma. Now we're up to 11 years. This whole Federalist, anti-Federalist debate, where these are 85 essays published in a New York paper over time, that took a long time. So there's a 2-year gap between leaving this hot, smelly room in Philadelphia after getting the basic Constitution worked out. It didn't contain the Bill of Rights, by the way, because they wanted to go home. They wanted out of there. And so they wound up signing it, and they left to come back. But that's when this debate is going. This is a 13-year struggle while they're all faltering under the Articles of Confederation. So that is what has been going on in these debates. And so, they're arguing about, well, what does government need to be? What does it need to do? What is the purpose of government? How shall we operate? we need something to protect us from foreign invasion and protect our property. They agreed that government is a necessary evil, and that the government also couldn't be whipped around by public whim at all times. So this is the actual signing. This is what it looked like. There were 55 delegates. How many of you have been to the room in Philadelphia, Freedom Hall? And isn't that kind of cool? Can you imagine being locked in that room for 4 months in the dead of summer with your bestest of friends? By the way, these were not good friends. You study about it. We're going to get into that. These guys did not always really get along. This wasn't a real nicey, gentlemanly thing. There were very hot and intense debates, and it was physically hot and miserable. And so, well, what were some of these things? These were the prime drivers of the debate. Right up there, the need for a more powerful form of government. They knew they had to have some form of government that performed the good things that a monarchy does. What? There's good things that a monarchy does? Well, yeah, monarchy does a pretty good job sometimes on executing and getting things done. They needed to prevent tyranny. Probably 60% of the debate is about how to control the distribution of power. No, I'd say 80% of it. This whole notion of the states at this point are all powerful. The limited government under the Articles of Confederation couldn't tax you. They had no source of money. They were 100% dependent on all the states, large and small states. Well, hey, wait a minute. Somebody told me they were from Rhode Island. Never gets the respect, right? Rhode Island never gets the respect. Virginia and New York, huge states. Right now, everybody gets one vote. Now they're talking about doing it as a representative republic, meaning it's going to be done on population. Rhode Island's going, not me, no. And other little states, they were fighting it. And you've got the big issue of slavery. You had some states that it was pretty well ingrained and growing, and you had other states that were not. This was the one issue. They did a compromise we'll talk about, but they couldn't resolve it. They spent at least of the 4 months, a little over 2 some odd weeks debating slavery in and of itself, trying to work that issue out. And it still came back to haunt them. And then the basic issues of commerce. Are we going to have a government? Are we going to keep letting states print all their own currency, or are we going to have a central system? Are we going to have a bank, a common bank? How is all that going to work? So we had to get that done. I'm going to try to play, we rebooted this, I'm going to try to play this, but they needed, this is key. People will say, oh, they compromised. Oh, they compromised on electoral college, they compromised with this 3/5 thing. What do you mean somebody's 3/5 of a person? All these issues. The key was there was a prevailing belief that they needed all 13 states. They couldn't get 12, they couldn't get 11. They needed to get everybody on board. And right now, with slavery, for example, South Carolina and Georgia were a holdout. So let's see if this, I'm going to do it this way.
How many representatives to the House of Representatives will each state get? That depends, again, in the most democratic mode possible in a Republican regime, on the population of the state. In the House, the bigger states will have the advantage over the smaller states. The question of who is to be counted in the population of each state raised a crucial question which stirred the Constitutional Convention and went to the heart not only of the government to be established, but to the fundamental principles, purposes of the American regime, as enunciated in the Declaration of Independence. How would the slaves be counted? Slaves were not citizens. Among many other things, they could not vote. To count them as part of the population of the state would give the citizens of states where slaves were numerous more power per capita in the House than the citizens of states where slaves were uncommon. If all slaves were counted, this would maximize the power of the states with the most slaves at the expense of the states with the fewest slaves. Although Publius does not mention it, this led Pennsylvania delegate Gouverneur Morris to charge that the states with the most slaves were in effect aristocracies, not real republics at all. James Madison, the Virginia slaveholder, who is often called the father of the Constitution, concurred with Morris, writing in a couple of unpublished notes that we know from his papers that, quote, in proportion as slavery prevails in a state, the government, however democratic in name, must be aristocratic in fact. The power lies in a part instead of the whole, in the hands of property, not of numbers. All the ancient popular governments were, for this reason, aristocracies.
We're going to take a 10-minute break, but I want to leave you with this thought. The summary of what he is saying is, let's say I'm out of Georgia, and you are all my slaves. As a landholder, we're now back to the English that only those that are big landholders get to say. In other words, I would have disproportionate representation in Congress simply because in my district it's highly populated by my slaves. I control that vote. So as one person, it isn't equal. And the northern states and the southern states came up with this workaround, not the solution to slavery. By the way, slavery was not an American problem. It was not unique. Every civilization in the history of the world had some form of slavery. From the Greeks, the Romans, back to antiquity, as long as there have been people. Even the American Indians would capture other tribes, and they had different forms of slavery. The other thing they don't tell you is most of the English people that came over as indentured servants, a form of slavery that wasn't really pleasant. And so all of this was a world problem inherited by America, and that America could not, as we know, get past this. But they did deal with it, and they thought it was fading. Maybe not as quick, but that with mechanization and other things, that this would be an institution that would go away by itself. They were wrong. It eventually cost the nation dearly, but they needed the practical side of these men, said, we got to get something done while we're here. And this is what they came up with, was to balance out slave versus non-slave states and not create a new form of aristocracy where it was your rights are given by property. With that, let's take a 10-minute break, get a cookie, and relax, and come back, and we're going to get right back on it to get back on time.
I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. And Madison goes on to explain that you can either try to eliminate the causes of faction or you can try to control the effects of faction. But he again very importantly notes that the causes of faction are, he says, sown in the nature of man. Right? They are part of human nature. Right? And therefore they cannot be eliminated unless you want to eliminate or try to transform human nature. They arise, Madison says here, especially from what he calls the diversity in the faculties of men, which we could say are the various and unequal temperaments, endowments, and abilities that people have. In other words, the human beings are diverse. Human beings are naturally unequal, and this inequality of ideas, of passions, of interests, of ambitions is what gives rise to factions. And those.
So, you know, a couple things here. Throughout the Federalist Papers, and, you know, we started this by two views of America. The interesting thing is part of the early progressive movement in the 1900s is based on the argument that mankind is evolving, we're evolving past all this. The Federalist Papers clearly do not, while they call for men of virtue and they call for, you know, people, an educated public, they do not base their hopes in the greatness of mankind in our youth. In fact, they're planning for kind of the worst in human nature to a certain extent, or they've lowered the standard of human conduct to build into the Constitution what they refer to as auxiliary precautions. Because you get this belief, they didn't think humans were going to change. That people still are ambitious, people still are self-interested, people are, this is the way people are, and it's been that way since antiquity because they have studied that. So I'm just telling you what their view of it is. But here's the big argument that they had to take on. On one side, you had Cato and Brutus saying, wait a minute, Montesquieu himself says that you can't govern a territory the size of the United States. Remember, it wasn't as big as it is now, because we hadn't even done the Louisiana Purchase and westward expansion. It's saying the 13 colonies are already bigger than anything that Montesquieu said has already failed. So clearly, if you're putting a representative republic together, it can't work. And what Madison does is and they said, democracy's out of the question. The states are already bigger than what Montesquieu said could work. So Madison mounts this argument, and it's a unique argument. That's why it's original. He says, look, the bigger the place is, the harder it is for anybody to get a faction together to dominate with a majority, and the larger and more diverse opinion in a compound republic, okay, that's a big one. Compound republic means you've got a state level, you've got a federal level. You can't get enough power in one area to have a faction that dominates everything. That is the summary of Federalist 10. So let's hear what Paul has to say about it.
And it is probably the most original work of American political theory, the one that puts James Madison in the ranks of the greatest political minds in the modern period. The reason why Federalist 10 was so important in the effort to get the Constitution ratified was because in it, Madison deals with the most important of all the anti-Federalist arguments against the Constitution. The anti-Federalist strongest argument, their most fundamental criticism of the proposed Constitution, was that no government could be the size of the continental United States and still be a republic. The only way you could govern a continent the size of America was by some sort of monarchy, some sort of imperial, some sort of consolidated government. A republican government would be impossible. Republican government meaning government based on the consent of the majority. And in this paper, Madison explains that actually an extended republic, a larger republic, is not going to destroy republicanism, but actually improve republican government. So if the Federalists are able to win this argument, they will overcome the most important obstacle that they face. If the Anti-Federalists were able to convince people that this government could not be a Republican government, then the Constitution would never have been ratified, because the overwhelming consensus of Americans in 1787 was that Republican government, the consent of the government, the spirit of the American Revolution was indispensable. No government that was not a Republican government would be acceptable and could be ratified. All the
So in here, as they talk about these auxiliary provisions, what they're saying is human faction, you can plan for it, but you're not going to eliminate it. And hasn't that proven true? But this is one of the interesting criticisms. And when you look at what he did, it's Madison, you never get any hint that he ever thought that the minority could dominate. They said, oh, they'll just be voted down. Well, and this is a serious criticism that's occurred, is that they were so focused on trying to make sure that 51% didn't dominate. They never thought about today, I mean, with the internet and a lot of other things, how you can have such a minority, a vocal minority, create such dominant faction. So this was one of the most famous statements out of the Federalists.
Sure. Rather low view. He goes on. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? Publius makes a famous observation. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. But men are not angels. And government, as a result, must be controlled.
So, that really what we need to look at is, as they got into designing it, Madison really thought the majority could just be voted down, and he didn't spend a lot of time. And then there was a fair amount of criticism that came about. This is related to this notion of this compound republic, a vertically compound, horizontally compound by separation of powers. And this is what they were convincing.
And on their side, the authority of Montesquieu, who made the argument that historically republics had always been confined to very small places, thinking here especially of the city-states of the ancient world, Athens, Sparta, and Rome especially. And in Federalist 9, as I think Dr. Ray already discussed, the Federalist, in that case Hamilton, was able to use Montesquieu for their own side. And Montesquieu goes on to explain that if you could combine the benefits of a large government or an imperial government with those of a small or republican government, you could have a new kind of confederation that would actually be unprecedented and successfully combine these two types. In Federalist 9, Hamilton said, quoting Montesquieu, "It is very probable that mankind would have been obliged at length to live constantly under the government of a single person had they not contrived a kind of constitution that has all the internal advantages of a republican together with the external force of a monarchical government. I mean a confederate republic." And this is the beginning of the argument that the Federalists make that this government is neither going to be strictly unitary or consolidated, nor strictly confederal, where the states are sovereign, but a compound or a combination of both. And on their side,
now, Madison's work took a major hit, at least initially in the 1900s. And this guy, Charles A. Beard, when he started taking Madison's writings about equality, they got twisted to equality of outcomes. In other words, he took Madison's words and use of property to be like we think. Property meaning my house, my bank account, my this, my that. What Madison was really referring to in talent was ability, talents, work ethic, and never advocated that people should ever be economically equal, that outcomes would be equal. And this, around 1913, made it into the public lexicon. Baird did take a beating. He was called a communist, all kinds of things. But again, in academic circles, he was heralded.
Interpretations of Federalist 10 came about 100 years ago among the progressives, and especially the progressive political scientist Charles A. Beard, who in 1913 wrote his famous book, An Economic interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. And Beard made the argument in this interpretation that the Federalists really were themselves a faction, that they were an interest group, that they wanted a stronger central government because they wanted one that would be strong enough to redeem the continental debt in which they had speculated. The founders were actually just a bunch of sort of scheming, self-interested speculators, and that's what the Constitution was really about. But Beard's larger argument was that all politics is about economic interest. And when he was, and this was in 1913, this is quite a startling, quite a scandalous argument to make. The Progressives were the first to really call into question the soundness and the legitimacy of the founding since the secessionists. And to sort of impute these kind of motives to the founders was quite an event, caused quite a stir in 1913. And of course, Beard was accused of being a Marxist. This idea that sort of history, all history is determined by economic class conflict. And Beard defended himself against that charge by saying, this isn't Marx that I'm drawing from, this is Madison. That Madison's argument in the 10th Federalist, especially that the most enduring source of faction is about the unequal distribution of property, is really the basis of his critique of the Constitution. In fact, I think Madison is making quite the opposite argument. First of all, one group of historians in the 1950s, especially Robert Brown and Forrest McDonald, showed that Beard's historical details were actually inaccurate. But also, I think Beard's larger political theory about, or argument about the political theory that Madison was making was inaccurate. If you look at what Madison says about property and its unequal distribution, you can see that he's making really the opposite of the Marxist argument. When Madison says the diversity in the faculties of men, he's talking about men's varying characters, interests, aptitudes, or talents, or what Madison called in another place property. Right? All of the things that human beings possess, not just their stuff, but their inclinations, their talents, their abilities. This diversity in the faculties of men, he says, from which the rights of property originate, makes it impossible for government to make everybody have the same interests. Rather, Madison says, the protection of these diverse and unequal faculties, these property rights that individuals have, is the first object of government. So really, Madison, I think, is making an anti-Marxist argument that government is meant to preserve the natural diversity, natural inequality of human beings.
I need to change to the next. Get this. I thought this might be, we're getting ready to jump right into the Constitution.
Comes wonder war with it.
But I'm going to play this, and does the Constitution matter? Because for the young people in the room, this is why we're here today. This is what we're studying. And then I'm going to read to you some current events that are happening just a little south of us. But you might want to listen to
If they get the discretion, sooner or later, some of them are going to abuse it. In our Constitution reader, we read the Progressives. John Dewey's argument is, it's a new world. Really different. And as the world changes, he goes on to argue, it changes how we think. John Dewey says those principles in the Declaration of Independence, he says those fit for a pioneer agrarian society. People thought like that, right? Back then. And so everything's changed now. The old idea was we're human, we're capable of really great things, says the Federalist, and we're capable of really bad things, says the Federalist. And so we need to arrange the government so that there's a bias in favor of the good things we can do. And government should be limited, just strong enough to protect us from one another. And don't give it absolute power, because men are not angels, true enough, and they have to have government, but angels do not govern men. That's one. And another world is, wow, look how much more we can do. By using these techniques, let's do it. Let's get going here, right? Let's solve these problems. Let's get these checks and balances out of the way. Let's stop this kind of government that's offset against itself, so it's always hampered and always a problem, right? That's the argument. And if you just look at the power of modern science, look at the incredible things it can achieve, doesn't that argument have great force? But you tell me what's wrong with it.
I don't know that I'll be able to fully develop this, but it seems like the last couple days we've really established that the true genius of the Constitution was separating the sovereignty from the power and keeping those two things separate so that they can check one another and keep an eye on one another. It seems as you move towards this bureaucratic structure that we're talking about, you create like other tyrants. You create health problems or economic problems as tyrants. So in order to combat that, you have to they're arguing to recombine that sovereignty and the power and put them in the same hands to combat that. But then we forget that fundamental principle in the Declaration of Independence, like all men are created equal. And when we yoke the sovereignty and power again, then we challenge that very thing, that all men are created equal.
You mean, you're not, what are you going to say?
Well, we're talking about how whether or not the principles of the Constitution still apply in a radically different world. But even if we're not an agrarian society anymore, we're still a society of humans, and human nature doesn't change. We still suffer from the same ills and make the same mistakes.
So you're both saying it different ways. Your argument is like Madison's argument. You're saying that these people are not angels, right? And so if they get a discretion, sooner or later, some of them are going to abuse it. You're saying that doesn't change. And you're saying that's nature. The excellence of the human being is nature. And the failings of the human being are nature. And nature doesn't change. Because remember, we define this term nature, right? And this term nature governs, it starts with babies, it starts with seeds. But then it includes this fallenness of human beings, right? This capable of greatness, capable of evil, both. And that arrangement of government. And if you set out to overcome that, then here's the final question. If you can design your society any way you want to, what standard will you use to design it? What can give you any guidance? I can tell you what happened in Nazi Germany, right? Because they just go right down this road. And what it means is the guide that remains after everything else has been eliminated is strength. Only power can untrain. Now what that means then, I argue, is that these problems that come up in society, sure enough, one of the reasons we have the government is to help solve these problems. But if we think about it, we understand that, yeah, of course we need to make things better in society. We need to treat people as well as we can treat them. But also we have to be a little suspicious of concentrating power.
I'm going to share with you
angels.
I'm going to share with you, this is right out of today's headlines. This is right out of Central America. You could say, well, these are all banana republics. That's where the term comes from, younger folks. Guatemala is locked in a troubled presidential election for the country, in the most troubled presidential election in the country's history. And it goes on to say that Alvarado is under a judicial attack attempted by the government to disqualify his party and keep him from running for election. They have already banned several candidates in the first round vote. So they're using the government's power to keep him from even getting on the ballot and running for people. Just next to that, in El Salvador, this guy, President Bukele, 1 year ago, he entered into an all-out war with Barrio 18 These are all different MS-13 kind of gangs. Probably a good thing. Crime was spiking. First thing he did, he suspended constitutional rights. He threw 1 in every 100 people in the country into prison. And that has fueled allegations that there's human rights abuse. Go figure. The sharp dip in violence, however, that followed was combined with an elaborate propaganda machine that has ignited a pro-Berkey populist fever and is now going out to other parts of Central America. Berkey announced, this is probably no surprise, that he's going to run for re-election next year despite the Constitution prohibiting it because he's already termed out. And anyway, now you go to Nicaragua. Remember Iran-Contra, and we had Daniel Ortega? Well, he's come back. They had their run, but he's in an all-out crackdown on dissidents. For years, regional watchdogs in the U.S. have raised alarms that democracy was eroding under the leadership of the Sandinista National Liberation. Isn't it funny? It's a liberation party. The front came in 2018 when they began a violent crackdown on protesters. Recently, Noriega forced hundreds of opposition figures into exile. He stripped them of their citizenship. He seized their property. He declared them as traitors to the homeland. Nicaragua has thrown out aid groups such as Red Cross, the Catholic Church, forced the Vatican to close its embassy, and a tightening chokehold has prompted Nicaraguans to flee their country for asylum. Oh, and it talks about how he's cracking down on dissidents. A dissident is anybody that disagrees with the government. So if you speak up down there, you better run for cover because they're going to get you, your family, they're going to take it. This is what this was talking about. It's when you start to suspend constitutional rights, rule of law, you now see the beginning of how somebody's becoming a dictator down in Guatemala. He's already throwing it out the window. Any comments on that?
Greg?
Yes.
I just want to add, it kind of fits. I just heard today, you may have heard, Oakland, California, the police have just warned the Oakland residents they're going to have to defend themselves. They can no longer protect them. The home invasions, the lootings, the carjackings are out of their control. And so I'm just wondering what city's next. So we may be headed in that direction.
Taking the guns?
I'm just, they're just telling people you better arm yourself.
Well, I know, I'm just saying.
Yes.
Yes. Somewhere in there, it says that all laws passed by the Congress are the supreme law of the land if you have pursuant to the Constitution.
That's correct. We're going to get into that. This notion that the Constitution is different from other laws. In the Constitution, if you read it, they primarily are given the authority to pass what we call statutory laws. Walk your dog on the leash. Don't throw garbage into here. Don't do that kind of thing. The Constitution has its own process and can only be, we're going to get into how do you amend the Constitution? And the short answer is only the people. The people created the Constitution. The Constitution is authorized by the people. Only the people can amend it. That's the difference between that and legislative law. Yes?
So I just wanted to mention, since we're talking about the Constitution and who judges the Constitution is our Supreme Court. Ecuador has pretty much the same Constitution we have. Right. The only difference in their situation is the president appoints the judges. So everybody's hand in hand. And the judges will rule as the president. So
I'm glad you brought that up because is it the Supreme Court's job to be the sole arbitrator of what's constitutional? We're gonna address that point, but you're dead on. So let's get into this whole notion of what separation of powers means, because we've got to control power.
The separation of powers is extremely important to the founders because it turns out structure counts. They couldn't depend on the mere demarcation of written rules to prevent the accumulation of power. So they structured government in a way that would do it itself. The separation does three things for us. One, it prevents the accumulation of power by separating it out. Another, by defining powers into different spheres, it makes those branches focus on their functions and do them well, making laws, executing laws, adjudicating laws. And by forcing them to compete over those powers, it makes them serve the Constitution by doing their duty, which encourages constitutional responsibility. So the function, which we take for granted, is central, key to how the Constitution works to prevent tyranny and bring about good Republican government.
When you look at the government, or any government, there are really three functions. There is the function of legislation. In other words, a group that has to say, these are the laws we're going to live by. This is the law of the land. This is how you need to behave for the good of all. The second part is you've got to execute the laws. Somebody needs to carry the power of the sword, the ability to go in and enforce the law and do the things that are necessary to protect the country. And then you've got a group that has to be able to adjudicate the law, that we would call the legal system. And their answer to that is, we're not going to get rid of tyrants, we're not going to get rid of ambition, but we're going to use tyrants to fight tyrants, we're going to use ambition to fight ambition. We're going to give people lanes, and we're going to give them the tools that they need to protect themselves. So,
as he says,
I am going to move ahead on this, because what are these means that each of the branches of government can push back on the others? Well, in the Constitution, they give the executive branch, that being the president, the ability to veto, direct veto, pocket veto. There's a question of executive orders. Good luck finding them in the Constitution. They're not there. There's a very loose interpretation about where they come from, and we're going to look at how frequent they have become. He has the power to nominate Supreme Court justices. This is probably what has become, as the court has grown in power way beyond what the founders originated. You would probably be surprised to hear that Alexander Hamilton called the judiciary the least dangerous branch. We're going to hit that. Why would he say that? But this is a lasting legacy, and of course all the other nominations. Can the president spend money that is not appropriated by Congress? Not constitutionally. So the power of the purse is in the legislation. So each chamber sets their own rules. Senate's the Senate, right? Senate's the Senate, and House is a House. They have totally different. They each can make laws. They can override an executive veto. So if the president vetoes it, they've got a process for being able to do it, and they also have various powers to impeach. But again, they divided the power. Who can actually do the impeachment? House. Who does the trial? They divided it. So that's part of the wisdom in the separation of powers. Well, what can the Supreme Court do? Well, tradition now has said, well, they can declare a law unconstitutional. Some would say they even legislate from the bench a little bit by twisting. They can they have light appointments, and that was done to lessen the intimidation, to make sure they felt secure, that they were above the fray, that they weren't political. You may have just seen that, Chief Justice Roberts and Kavanaugh are on a media campaign to try to portray that the court's not political. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't know the inner workings. They're a very secretive group. The opinions of the majority and the minority, they write both sides of it. Seldom is there a unanimous opinion, and even if there is, somebody may write an addendum to it. And the question is, do they legislate from the bench, or they have fidelity to it? Now, we get to this notion of amending the Constitution. It's been amended 27 times to fit various situations. We can go into what some of those are, but there have been some times where the Constitution has had some glitches in it. One occurred that we'll get when Aaron Burr tried to pull a fast one on Thomas Jefferson as running mate, and while he was running for VP, he saw an opportunity to become president and tried to pull it off. So that got amended, and I believe that is the 17th Amendment. And so, by what means shall we amend the Constitution? So let's go down here.
This is not sufficient.
It can be amended by the legislature by a 2/3 vote in both houses. So you have to have this idea of a supermajority. We just don't have to have a little agreement. We got to have the mass of the people. This is unusual for Congress to be able to get together and come in and actually agree to that extent. And it has to be both the House, okay, to get that supermajority. Now, there's another little tool called the Convention of States. The governors can call a convention of states, and they have to get 3/4 of the state's legislature, and they have then the ability to make changes to the Constitution. If Congress won't act, they can go around Congress and do it in that regard. But ultimately, if they make a change to the Constitution, like, free hot dogs every Friday, that still has to go back for ratification to all the states before it becomes law. And again, we're back to only we, the people, can do that. So what would the world be like if every time there's a big public passion, something happens tomorrow, like the World Trade Center, and people were reacting with emotion and the Constitution could be changed just like that? What would that be? We skipped over a video, but it was Thomas Jefferson. I didn't have a video of Thomas Jefferson. Let me clarify. What I did have is a quote from him where he talks about, he's in disdain about the French Constitution, which changes so rapidly. He says it ought to be housed in the periodical section of the library, of the public library, because it won't be the same tomorrow. But it talks about this idea that to change the Constitution should take a massive amount of deliberation, careful thought, and be well supported across the country. So let's take a look at this, and then we'll move on to
The separation of powers does three things. First, it protects against government tyranny by checking the encroachment of power, one branch to another, and preventing its accumulation all in one place by dividing and separating. Second, by keeping powers in their proper sphere, lawmaking, executing, adjudicating, it allows each branch, it encourages each branch to perform its function well. Lawmaking, executing, adjudicating. And third, it replaces popular appeals, the politics of passion, with the give and take of the branches, which will resolve conflicts through deliberation and argument, and in practice by competing and arguing, and in principle by serving the Constitution, it will be more constitutionally responsible. This implies, an argument seen throughout the Federalist Papers, that the formation of a common opinion above and beyond mere interest is a crucial aspect of the Publicis project. And the key to that opinion is our common understanding, respect, and reverence for the Constitution. We have gone far astray on this account. The modern method of government, by administration, accumulates more and more power under unelected bureaucrats, nominally under the executive branch.
We'll hit that in a little bit. The framers never perceived the presidency or the executive branch to be the most powerful. They all came out of legislatures and they believed legislature was the most powerful. They spent most of their time debating it and came up, fancy word coming, bicameral, 2 houses. So they split it up into 2 sections, but the debate was, well, we're going to have this house and it's going to be democratically elected by districts, not by state, but by districts in the state. We're going to have 435 representatives, and the small states said, you can't do that because now we're diminished. So in a compromise, they came up with the Senate, and the Senate serves a different purpose. So let's get into what are these issues. Well, the House, again, I want you to put this in your mind, okay? Keep these in mind. Texas and California, 38 million in California, 28 million in Texas, right? I'm so sorry, I didn't put Rhode Island down here, but we have Vermont with 600, if you ever, Uncle Bernie, 625 constituencies. 625,000 people voted in the state of Vermont. In Wyoming, big state, not a lot of population, 578. Now, how many senators do you think Texas gets? 2. Now you get Vermont with 2. So all of a sudden, in the Senate, these smaller states had power. So remember we started with the Articles of Confederation and big or small? Vermont would have 1 vote, and if Texas was there, Texas would have had 1 vote. How many people we have in Collin County here? 1.5 million? Anybody know? I don't know. It's got to be 1.5 to 2 million. We're like 3 times bigger. We don't get 2 senators, do we? So, but now the purpose of the House was that they'd be responsive to you, that they would be in touch with their local people, life would be good, and they're in and out, quick terms, 2 years, they're gone, and it was fair to these states with large. Now, to be a congressman and go serve this 2-year term, you had to be a U.S. citizen, but you could be a naturalized U.S. citizen. Could Arnold Schwarzenegger be a U.S. congressman? Yes, he could, because he's a naturalized U.S. citizen. I didn't say he'd be a good one. I'm just saying he fits it. You had to be 7 years of residency. You actually had to live in the district you were going to represent, which might be interpreted rent a condo. I don't know. Elected by districts, not by state. Now that was key because it was thought to give some independence against separation of power from what goes on at the state. Although the state has say in how the districts are set, and they had to be, can you imagine having to be 25 years old? That's like ancient, right? Right, JT? I mean, how old would you have to be 25 years old? That's like, you're over the hill. It's awful. And so they had these 2-year terms, but no term limits. Now, the purpose of the House was they were to get wise people, people that were above the fray. They're going to give them 6-year terms. And originally, they were appointed by the states. When the Constitution was signed, they were appointed by the state legislatures and beholding to those state legislatures. And so a lot of politics, but if a state didn't like what their senator is doing, they could recall them. They could get them out of there pretty quick and get them back. And it was considered fair to these less populated states. Now there's only 100 senators. Okay, so it's a fairly elite body. You had to be a citizen. You could be a naturalized citizen. But there was an issue after the Civil War where there was some shenanigans going on in the states. And I think the senators decided, hey, my future's a little better too if I'm elected by the people than if I have to go answer to the state legislature. And that was changed. Today we elect our senators by popular vote. They have to run in our state and do that. So anyway, the Senate was supposed to be the calmer, the cooler, the wiser, deliberating body. And the House was supposed to be a little more volatile. But here's what I will tell you. This is a myth for some of you, especially the youngers. Framers never, ever envisioned politicians as a full-time job. Every one of them thought you go, you do, this was an act you had to do. It wasn't pleasant. You went, you served, you went home, you went back and had a regular job, a real job, you lived your life. You didn't go and have an entire career in Washington, D.C. That was not ever discussed in any of the Federalist Papers, nor did they see it. This is like a brick to the back of the head. If they were in here and we were talking, they go, what? You're kidding. You mean people go there and serve years and years and years? That is the truth. So let's hit this little legislate. This will be a good.
People of the United States. These are the words that open the American Constitution. We take them for granted now, but at the time they were written, they were earth-shattering. If you think that sounds like an exaggeration, consider this. No government had ever come into existence based on a document written for the people and approved by them. It makes perfect sense then that the most immediate and accountable branch of the government, the legislature, would be the first item on the Constitution's agenda. This is Article 1. It's divided into 10 sections. Section 1 creates a bicameral legislature. That is, a legislature made up of two separate entities, a House of Representatives and a Senate. Thus, the theme of the Constitution is immediately suggested. This is going to be a government in which power is both limited and shared. Section 2 describes how members of the House of Representatives are to be chosen. To run for office, you must be a citizen, reside in the state you're representing, and be at least 25 years of age. It's easy to miss, but at the time, this was another startling feature of the Constitution. Almost anyone could be a candidate for Congress. The citizen politician is an American innovation. Section 2 also describes who could vote and how many people it takes to make up a congressional district. This shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons and 3/5 of all other persons. This last phrase refers, of course, to slave.
Well, guess what? We will work on that again. 1 second, and we'll be back online. Let's go to here, and we're going to pick up some time. This probably doesn't surprise anybody, but this is the number of years for candidates running for office, meaning they're trying to get reelected. How about for the Senate? They've already got 11.2 years under their belt before they're going for their next term as a senator. And how about 8.5 years before they are headed to the House again in 2-year terms? So that means they've already served 4 or 5 terms and they're running for a 6th. And then when you look at the number who did not seek re-election, that in the last couple sessions has been at 13% or below. So keep that in mind in the legislature. Now let's go down. I really do want, I hope this one will play appropriately because I want you to hear it. I found this in the Federalist. Now think about this written 250 years ago and compare it to what's going on today.
The Senate will give the American Republican regime at least some of the stability with those 6-year terms that they have. Now, respecting domestic lawmaking, He continues, the internal effects of a changeable policy are still more calamitous. It poisons the blessings of liberty itself. Why? Because, he says, it will be of little avail to the people that the laws are made by men of their own choice, if the laws be so voluminous that they cannot be read, or so incoherent that they cannot be understood, if they be repealed or revised before they are made known to the public, or undergo such incessant changes that no man who knows what the law is today can guess what it will be tomorrow. Such a condition, constantly changing laws, gives, he says, an unreasonable advantage to the sagacious, the enterprising, and the moneyed few over the industrious and uninformed mass of the people. Now, a couple of points should be mentioned about these last few arguments. Notice first that the mass of the people are industrious and uninformed. These two things are connected. An industrious citizen who concentrates energy and attention upon providing for a family and managing the household won't have time to stay informed about every twist and turn of an ever-changing set of law.
So think about this. I want to get here. Since our founding, legislature has passed over 30,000 laws. Now, if you don't think that's bad, wait till you think about this. Who makes most of the laws that we live under today? You ever hear of the ABC agencies? EPA, OSHA, CDC, SEC, FDA, anyway, they're making all these regulations, they're making all these laws, and on top of that, they make 3,000 to 45,000 new regulations. So legislature creates an agency or a department and provides it with funding, and they go to town doing what they do, and they make laws. When was the last time anybody in this room sat down and read the IRS tax code? I don't even think they read it, by the way. I think they make it and they put it away. That is the issue, is that what he's talking about is that who are the money and the sagacious few? The moneyed and the sagacious few. They're controlling what legislation gets done, and even writing it, by the way. Lobbyists, interest groups, that is where all this is coming, and that's what he's getting at. So this is about the administrative state and the rise of power, but we're going to go on to the executive branch. This is interesting because from a historical perspective, everybody thinks, oh, well, we know the presidency and that's how they did it. No. This is what they went through. They said, well, we're going to create maybe a limited monarchy. Why wouldn't we want to make George Washington the monarch? He's a good guy. Well, who's going to follow George Washington? Who's the next one? By the way, he didn't have an heir, so it wasn't like we had that problem, but somebody would. Then they went and said, no, we're going to do this through a national legislature, and that got voted down because we're already trying to do that. It's not working. Oh, I know. A committee. They worked so well at Heritage Ranch. Let's put those committees in, and that's how we're going to run the executive branch, is by a plurality of dual presidency kind of guys. They're going to all work in a committee. Executive life appointment. They actually were going to make somebody president for life. There will be aid administered in the back. If I say anything that gets you that upset, we'll do that. Okay, and then they got down to, well, we'll just have all the people. It'll be a big national election. And that didn't work. Then they said, no, we're going to have all the governors vote on it. Well, there was a number of ideas, but two of them resonated with a majority of the delegates. And they went into a committee, and after the committee, James Madison authored what we call the Electoral College. And the Electoral College, I think this is key, because we already talked about how the states were all fighting amongst themselves. This was Hamilton's argument in the Federalist, in Federalist 9, that sort of summed it up. And I wasn't a fan of Hamilton, but this is not because he's cool now and he's got his own Broadway thing. That's beyond the point. The way he writes is just like a bullet right to the issue. And here's what he says. He said, if we therefore receive his, that's Montague's idea on this point, as the criterion of truth, we shall be driven to the alternative, either taking refuge and once in the arms of a monarch, or splitting ourselves into infinite little jealous, clashing, tumultuous commonwealths, the wretched nursery of unceasing discord and the miserable objects of universal pity and contempt. You think we're bad now as 13 states. Wait till we're divided into 28, 29, 50 little states, and we're all squabbling and fighting. We're going to be the pity of the world. And that was part of the argument that got them through to this notion of having a strong executive. And Hamilton even advocates, yeah, things didn't turn out so well in Rome, but Rome lasted a long time, and they did go a fair amount of time with some really good leadership before they got into a crisis, and what did they do? They granted Caesar power to solve the problem. Unfortunately, Caesar never gave that power back, and you had some of the worst despots in the history of humanity follow him. But they began with this idea, and so this was the key question right here. Can you have a strong unitary executive and he not become a tyrant? That was the hot debate. And so let's try this again. We're going to see, when we get to this, you must be 35 years of age. If you guys, I know it's a long time, but you're going to have to wait to be a president. And you have to be natural born. They wanted the president to be born on American soil or through the process, born to American parents. So that would disqualify Arnold. Arnold could not be president, by the way. So that would put it, and you had to actually be in the United States for 14. Now, here was an interesting thing. They originally had this with no term limits, but when did they change that? Franklin Delano Roosevelt, because tradition said and honor said they were going to do 2 terms. George Washington sent it as president, that's the way it was, and all of a sudden FDR is running for his 4th term. And that was bipartisan legislation that said, not a good idea. So after his death, he did not make the 4th term. It passed in the form of the 22nd Amendment in 1951. That became law. So now the president, out of all the offices, is one limited by terms. So we already talked about this. When you go to vote for the president, you're really not voting for the president, you're voting for the electorate. And they went through a whole bunch of different ways as to how the president would be elected. They said, we're going to let the legislatures do it. We're going to let the governors do it. We're going to do all this. But they came up with the Electoral College, and it really wasn't a real controversial thing until kind of recently, like in my lifetime. And so they started getting into it. Right now, 48 states have a winner-take-all scenario, meaning you win by the states, so you get all the electoral votes. And this is an example. Bill Clinton won like 43% of the popular vote, but he got 60% of the electoral votes. It has a tendency to produce very clear winners. And imagine this. Some of you are old enough to remember the Hanging Chads of Florida. If we didn't have the Electoral College, that could have been a national issue. We could have been recounting ballots nationally. It would have been everywhere. But when it's limited by that, the Electoral College by the framers was kind of almost like described as watertight compartments in a ship. And so it has, you know, it does get criticism, but it has worked pretty well. And I will tell you that there's one example that required an amendment, and that was Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Because Aaron Burr pulled a fast one and tried to get himself not elected vice president because it had gone to the House. When there is a tie in the Electoral College, it goes to the House to get settled, right? So he tried to flim-flam, and that's what happened. So they put in the 12th Amendment. So with that, this is executive orders through the years. Do you notice any numbers up there that kind of jump out at you? On the activism? Okay, and yeah, so you can see in the New Deal, 3,700 executive orders. So let's get into it. I wanted to show you some of this real quick. The least dangerous branch being the executive, the judicial branch. Well, why would that be? Let me sum it this way. These people had English roots, and in England, the court won its independence from the king. And it was doing some good stuff. It was considered part of the little guy. It was helping the people. And that's the attitude the framers went in. The framers would have never believed that the power of the courts are what they are today, that we're all sitting around waiting on every word that comes out of the Supreme Court in doing that. And I have one last thing. Time is running away, but I think we're going to do one last thing here. Let's go to the Bill of Rights. The Constitution was ratified, and these guys wanted to go home. But there were two objectors. George Mason was one, who said, I'm not going to sign it because it does not have a Bill of Rights. And it was quite a few years later that they actually got back together and they came up with what are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. They originally came up with a list of about 22, I think it was. And then that got narrowed down to 12. But 10 of them got ratified. And the interesting part is, one of them that got rejected just got passed not long ago, and that's that if you're going to raise your pay, that doesn't go into effect until the next session of legislature. In other words, this legislature can't raise its own pay. It can only raise the pay of the next one. Now, they're getting reelected, but that took about 100 and something years more than 100 years to pass. But what are those 10 amendments? Because I think we would do that. It's the right to speak freely. It's the right to assemble, to keep and bear arms, no quartering soldiers. We've already talked about where that came from. Freedom from unreasonable search and seizure. So next time you go to the airport and you get TSA groping you, you pull this out of your pocket, okay? And you start reading it to them and ask them how they're doing it. The due process, meaning, you know, they can't force us to incriminate ourselves. We get speedy trials. And let's go to the next one. And the fact that we have a right of trial by jury, that was an innovation that came over from England. And freedom from cruel and unusual punishment, and the right to retain people. They cannot retain you or detain you indefinitely. You have to have something called a writ of habeas corpus, and you have to be charged with something. And power, and this is a key one. They finally, there was an argument that said, well, this is already in the Constitution, you don't need it in the Bill of Amendments. It was this right of power in the 10th Amendment that if we didn't specifically give the government power, they don't have it. They can't do something just because they want to. If it's not mentioned in the Constitution, they do not have the right. That was the framers' intent. Yes?
So how do you explain to our children Day 6?
How do
explain to our children that they don't have a right to hold them without trial and all these things, and yet we have all these jurisdictions that are in, being held, and I don't have any way to explain to my children why they do that and are able to do that if it's against the Bill of Rights.
All I can say is part of why I have my grandson here and why I talk to them is if we don't know about it and we don't understand it and we don't exercise it and we don't come together to fight it, you know how this will end. This is encroachment, it's slow, they try, they back up, they try again, they back up, and every time a right is not challenged, now all of a sudden, it becomes embedded into legal law, and the courts are less likely to reverse it. The whole thing with an executive order, you have a hard time finding where they have the right to do it, and if you look at the history of it, but now it's custom. And so, it's a slippery slope, and that's part of why understanding this, we ought to do it. The other thought I'll leave you with, because it's a question on here. When you look at the administrative state, if any of you have spent a minute, now I get nauseated watching congressional oversight. So legislature puts the big law in, and now they're hauling these departments up, and all you hear is, well, I have no knowledge of that, Senator. Well, I can't disclose that. Here I am, the head, and they're going, it's against our policy to talk about that. Well, who makes the policy? You do. Why? So, I'm thinking of like Christopher Wray's testimony this week. And he's proud that they're only violating FISA warrants constitutionally 20% of the time now. Big reform. We used to do it a whole lot more. Now we're only messing out of 100 citizens. We're only violating their constitutional rights 20% of the time. What an improvement. And he says it with a straight face. You have time and time again where Congress tries to do oversight, and it becomes a circus. It's not happening. And they know they'll be gone. I'm still here. I can't be fired. That's the rise of the fourth branch of government. And it's loyalty to Washington, D.C., not loyalty to we the people. And that's an issue in and of itself. And where a lot of the problems come is in the depth of all these laws and trying to understand them. So I'm going to be hanging around. I want to thank you, but we have an evaluation here. We want to hear from you. This is kind of an inaugural session, and so we experimented a little bit. We love your feedback. And we kind of kept it with inside of Heritage Ranch and the Republican Club. The question is there another role for this? But Jack?
Thank you very much. First of all, I think we all understand the enormous amount of work that Greg has put into this effort today. Secondly, the survey that's been placed in front of you is very important to us. We do a lot of work with surveys because we need to know where our members are because we're trying to serve our members. So please complete that document that tells us where and if we should go forward, and that's important that we know that. So please complete the document. Finally, on behalf of the Board of Directors of the Republican Club, I want to thank you for your attention and your presence here today. This was our inaugural attempt at this, and we, again, are excited to find out what you think. Yes, Regina.
Where do we put the surveys?
We'll just collect them here at the back.
I got it.
Please leave the surveys on the table. We'll get them. Just leave them in your place.